Just sign it, Dad. You don't even need to come inside. That's what my son said to me. Standing at the front door of the house I built with my own hands, in a neighborhood I chose because the schools were good and the streets were quiet, and I actually thought that one day my grandchildren would ride their bikes on those sidewalks. He handed me a clipboard through the 6-inch gap in the door like I was a delivery driver, like I was nobody. I stood there for a second. Just a second. Long enough to look past his shoulder and see the caterers setting up inside. White tablecloths. Flowers I didn't recognize. A bar cart that probably cost more than my first truck. You have people in there, I said. It's a housewarming, a small thing. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. My colleagues. You'd be uncomfortable. I took the clipboard. I looked down at the deed transfer form. My name was at the top, Kenneth Marsh, next to the word grantor. His name was below it. His wife's name next to his, in fresh ink, already signed. Your mother's not here either, I said. Mom understood. I didn't ask what she understood. My ex-wife had been understanding my son's choices for 30 years. It was practically her second career. I clicked the pen, looked at the line, and I said, I'll need to take this to my attorney before I sign anything. He finally looked at me then. A quick flash of something, annoyance maybe, or calculation. It's just a formality, Dad. The house is basically yours to give. You told me yourself. I tell you a lot of things, I said. I handed the clipboard back and walked to my truck. He called after me twice. By the second time, his voice had that edge to it. The one I first heard when he was about 16 and decided I was an embarrassment at his track meets because I cheered too loud. I kept walking. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start at that front door. It starts 23 years earlier with a foundation. I was 51 when I retired from the trades. 30 years of commercial construction. I started as a laborer, worked my way to project foreman, and by the time I was done, I'd put up office buildings, warehouses, a hospital wing outside of Columbus. My back had opinions about all of it. So did my knees. But I'd saved carefully, invested quietly, and when I retired, I had enough to be comfortable without being showy about it. The house on Aldercroft Lane was my project. 4 acres outside of Dayton, Ohio. I drew the plans myself on graph paper at my kitchen table. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a wraparound porch, a workshop in the back where I planned to spend my mornings. It took me 2 years to build it, mostly alone, with help from a few old colleagues on the framing weekends. Every beam was plumb. Every window was level. I knew every inch of that house the way you know a thing you made with your hands. My son Tanner was 28 when I finished it. He came down for the weekend with his then girlfriend, the woman who would become his wife, and walked through every room making the kinds of comments that sound like compliments but aren't. It's so rustic, Dad. Wow, you really did this yourself. She took pictures for her Instagram. He asked me twice if I'd considered selling and buying something more manageable. I let it go. He was young. He had ideas about what success looked like, and a farmhouse in Ohio didn't fit the frame. He married Melissa 2 years later. I paid for the rehearsal dinner, held at a steakhouse in Cincinnati, 43 people, just under $6,000. I gave them a check for $15,000 as a wedding gift. I smiled in every photograph. They bought a condo in Columbus, then a townhouse. Then Melissa got a position at a consulting firm in Cleveland, and they moved again. Tanner did well in finance. I won't take that from him. He worked hard, made good money, moved in circles I'd never been part of. Board memberships. Charity galas. The kind of life where your suit has a name. And somewhere in all of that, I became a problem to be managed. It happened slowly enough that I almost didn't notice. The Christmas visits got shorter. The phone calls became texts. The texts became the kind of one-line responses that technically answer a question without actually talking to you. When I mentioned my knee surgery, he sent flowers to the hospital, nice ones addressed to Kenneth, and called 3 days later for 11 minutes while he was clearly in his car going somewhere else. I told myself it was normal. Kids get busy. I told myself I wasn't the kind of father who needed constant reassurance. I had my workshop. I had my neighbors. I had Thursday nights at the VFW hall with men I'd known for decades. But I kept the house on Aldercroft Lane, and I kept it in my name. 2 years ago, Tanner started talking about the house differently. Not the house itself. He'd never loved it the way I did. But the land. 4 acres outside of Dayton had gotten interesting to developers. A subdivision had gone up nearby. Property values had moved, and suddenly my son, who once called my home rustic, was calling it an incredible asset. He suggested I transfer it to him for estate planning purposes. He had a financial advisor, a friend of his wife's brother, who had drawn up a strategy. I'd still live there, he explained. It would just be in the family structure in a more efficient way. He used that phrase 3 times. More efficient. I said I'd think about it. He had the paperwork drawn up anyway. I need to tell you something about Melissa, because the story isn't fair to tell without it. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that the version of her husband she wanted to present to the world didn't include a father who wore work boots to family dinners and called the prime rate by the wrong name. She wasn't cruel about it. She was just selective. About what she mentioned, about who got invited to what, about which version of Tanner's story included me prominently and which version quietly left me in the margins. I don't think she sat down one day and decided to erase me. I think it just became habit. And my son, who loved her genuinely and completely, followed her lead the way people do when they've built their life inside someone else's judgment. What she said to me at Tanner's 41st birthday dinner, that's where I stopped forgiving the habit. It was at their house in Cleveland. The new one, the big one, the one with the wine refrigerator that held 200 bottles and a guest suite that nobody ever used. I'd driven 3 hours. I brought a card and a bottle of bourbon I'd been holding on to for 15 years. Pappy Van Winkle, the 15-year. The kind of thing you give someone when you want them to know you've been thinking about them for a long time. There were 8 people at that dinner. I knew none of them. There were Tanner and Melissa's world, a venture capitalist, a surgeon, a woman who apparently ran a foundation that did something with green infrastructure, her husband who did something else I never caught. They were perfectly pleasant to me, a little careful, the way people are careful around something they've been briefed about in advance. Midway through dinner, the conversation turned to backgrounds. Where people grew up. The surgeon mentioned his father had been a pipe fitter. I said I was in commercial construction 30 years. My father was a roofer. Just conversation. Just the truth. Melissa smiled. Kenneth is very proud of where he comes from, she said, to the table, in the tone you use to explain a child's behavior at a fancy restaurant. The table moved on. I cut my steak. Tanner didn't look at me. I drove home 3 hours that night instead of staying in the guest suite that nobody ever used. On the highway somewhere past Mansfield, I thought about my father, a roofer who never once made me feel like what he did for a living was something to be translated for other people, who handed me my first tool at age 8 and said, "This is how you make something that lasts." I thought about what I had built and what I had given and what I had driven 3 hours to bring to a dinner table where I was a footnote, and I started to get clear about some things. The Clipboard visit was in March. The birthday dinner had been the previous October. In those 5 months, I had met 3 times with my attorney, a woman named Patricia I'd used for every significant transaction of my adult life, and I had done something I'd been putting off for almost a decade. I rewrote my estate documents from scratch. The house on Aldercroft Lane, the 4 acres, the workshop, the wraparound porch, the 2 years of my retirement I had poured into every wall. I transferred it, not to Tanner, to a land conservation trust that would keep it as green space in perpetuity. They'd been asking me for years. I'd always said maybe. In November, I said yes, and I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning while the maple out back was dropping its last leaves. The financial accounts I redistributed, a portion to my church, a portion to the apprenticeship program at the Trades Council where I'd gotten my first job at 19N. They train young people for careers in construction, kids who don't have a family connection or a college path, kids who need someone to show them how to make something that lasts. The remainder to a modest trust administered by Patricia. drawing an income for me as long as I'm alive. There was a letter. I wrote it myself. 3 drafts on legal pad at my kitchen table. I said what I needed to say without cruelty, because cruelty would have been the easy thing, and I've never been interested in easy. I told my son that I loved him. I told him I had watched him grow into a man I didn't always recognize, and that I had spent too many years deciding that was my failure to correct rather than his choice to live with. I told him the house was gone, not as punishment, but as completion. It had been mine to build and mine to give, and I gave it to the land, which had been under it long before either of us arrived and would be there long after. I didn't mention Melissa by name. I mailed it certified mail. Return receipt requested. I kept the green card. The housewarming was in April. Tanner's new house, the one he bought with his own money, with Melissa's income, with no help from me. A good house, a beautiful house, actually, in a neighborhood I didn't know, in a suburb I'd never visited. I didn't begrudge him that. I want to be clear about that. He called 4 times after the Clipboard visit. I answered twice and kept both conversations short. He asked if I'd seen an attorney. I said I had. He asked about the deed transfer. I said it had been handled. He moved on, the way he always moved on, because in his mind, handled meant done in his favor. The invitation to the housewarming arrived by email, which told me something. Casual dress, no gifts necessary, just come celebrate with us. I RSVP'd yes. I drove to Cleveland on a Saturday morning in a clean flannel shirt and the good boots. I was late by 20 minutes. The house was full. 30, maybe 40 people. Exactly the kind of crowd Tanner and Melissa had built their life inside of. I said hello to the neighbors nearest the door. I got a sparkling water from the bar, because I don't drink at other people's parties when I might need to drive. Tanner found me near the back patio. He looked good. He always looked good. Dad. He shook my hand instead of hugging me, which was new. Glad you made it. Nice house, I said, and I meant it. I tried to reach you about the Aldercroft paperwork. I know. The attorney I used said, Tanner. I said his name quietly. Just his name. The way I used to say it when he was small and headed towards something that was going to hurt him. I need to tell you something. He waited. The house transferred in November. I donated the land to the Stillwater Conservation Trust. It's protected space now. It'll never be developed. I watched him. The estate has been restructured. Patricia handled everything. You'll receive a formal letter from her office next week, but I wanted to tell you myself, in person. He stared at me for a long time, long enough that someone behind him said something and he didn't hear it. You gave it away, he said finally. I gave it where it needed to go. To a land trust. His voice was flat, not to your son. The land didn't insult me, I said. The land didn't hand me a clipboard through a cracked door and tell me I'd make its friends uncomfortable. He flinched. I hadn't expected that. The flinch. There was something real in it. Something that might have been the version of my son who existed before the suits and the wine refrigerators and the careful way his wife explained me to dinner tables. Dad. I love you, I said. I will always love you. That doesn't change. I set my sparkling water down on the patio railing. But I spent 30 years building something with my hands so you'd have a foundation under you. And you handed me a clipboard. I walked through the house. I said goodbye to a few people near the door. I drove home to Dayton. They called that night. I let it go to voicemail. They called again Sunday and Monday. Tuesday morning, I was in my workshop. I was renting a small place now, a 2-bedroom on the east side of Dayton with a detached garage I'd converted, and I was working on a rocking chair I'd been building for my neighbor's new grandchild. Mortise and tenon joints. White oak, the kind of thing that takes longer than it needs to but lasts longer than anything else would. I listened to the voicemails on Tuesday afternoon. In the first one, he was angry. In the second one, he was confused. In the third one, the Monday evening one, he was quiet in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. He said he'd been thinking. He said he'd talked to Melissa. He said he didn't know what he'd expected me to do with my life and my property. But he knew he'd stopped asking. "I think I stopped asking a long time ago," he said, "and I told myself you were fine with that." I sat in the garage with the white oak in my hands, and I listened to that voicemail twice. I didn't call back that day, or the next, but I didn't delete it either. There's a thing that happens when you've worked with your hands your whole life. You develop a tolerance for the long process. You learn that a joint set in a hurry fails under pressure, and a joint set carefully, dry fit twice, glued once, clamped overnight, holds for generations. You stop expecting things to be finished before they're ready. My son is not a bad man. I want to be careful about that. He's a man who got comfortable inside a life that didn't have room for me the way I was. And instead of asking me to be different, he just quietly stopped making room. That's a particular kind of cowardice. Not dramatic, not villainous, just a slow subtraction. Whether that changes, whether he becomes the kind of man who drives 3 hours with a bottle of bourbon he's been saving, who stands at a front door with his whole chest, I don't know. I'm not holding my breath. I'm not refusing to hope either. What I know is this. The house on Aldercroft Lane is protected land now. On the first warm weekend last spring, I drove out there. I still can. The trust allows public walking access on the trails, and I walked the 4 acres for the first time since I'd signed the papers. The workshop is still standing. They'd kept it as a storage shed for trail maintenance equipment. There were 2 kids from the neighborhood using the back trail on mountain bikes, cutting through the maple stand I'd planted along the east edge when I first cleared the property. I stood there for a while. Just stood. Then I got back in the truck and drove home to my garage, where a white oak rocking chair was waiting to be finished. Some things you build to give away, some things you build to keep, and some things you build because the building itself is the point, because the act of making something solid and true is its own answer to every person who ever handed you a clipboard through a cracked door and called you a formality. My father was a roofer. He handed me my first tool at age 8. I have never once been ashamed of that. I've been thinking about the clipboard a lot lately. Not with anger. That passed faster than I expected. More like the way you think about a nail you found in a board you thought you'd checked twice. How did I miss it? How long had it been there? The truth is, I didn't miss it. I just kept deciding it wasn't what it looked like. That's the thing about the slow kind of loss. It doesn't announce itself. Tanner didn't wake up one morning and decide to make me small. It happened the way a house settles. Gradually, quietly, until one day a door won't close right and you realize the whole frame has shifted. I watched it happen and I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too proud, too old-fashioned. I talked myself out of what I was seeing for years. What I know now is that talking yourself out of what you're seeing is not patience. It's not humility. It's a slow surrender to someone else's version of who you are. And no one, not a son, not a daughter-in-law, not a dinner table full of people who need things explained to them, no one gets to decide that version but you. My father handed me a tool at age 8. He didn't give me a speech about it. He just put it in my hand and showed me how to use it. That was his whole philosophy of raising a person. You show them how to make something real, and then you trust them to keep making real things. He didn't raise me to be explained. He raised me to be stood behind. I failed that somewhere with Tanner. I wanted to be honest about that. I gave him everything he needed materially, and I held back on the harder thing, which was letting him fail and learn and build something he could actually be proud of. When a person has never had to make something with their hands, they stop understanding the value of what someone else's hands made. That's not cruelty. That's just a gap in their education, a gap I helped create. But understanding where something came from doesn't obligate you to keep paying for it. Knowing your own part in a story doesn't mean you owe the other person the rest of your chapters. When I walked out of that housewarming, I wasn't trying to punish my son. I wasn't running through the moment in my head like a victory. I was just done. Done with the version of myself that drove 3 hours to be a footnote. Done with the version of my life that got handed back to me on a clipboard through a cracked door. The white oak rocking chair I built that winter is the best piece I've ever made. I took my time with it. Every joint dry fitted twice. I didn't rush because I was angry or slow because I was sad. I just worked. That's what you do when you know who you are. You work and you let the work be what it is. That chair is solid. It will outlast both of us. Some things only become possible once you stop apologizing for your own foundation.